It wasn't though. I was really hurt. Direction. Because I love.
Was it recording? Was it not record? Well, thinking it was recording, but it wasn't recording. Okay, love, relationship. Get the fuck out, mooch, smooch. I love you. God, intimate sector.
Myself more. And I love the future partnership more. When I first met Andriana on our first date, at the end of the date, she asked me, she goes, "So how old are you?" And I was like, "I'm 39.
She was what?
What's that?
What was she at that time?
Gosh, she was 25. Which, by the way, there was no way. I didn't know how old she was when we went on our first date. And because we met online. And I was like, there's no way. Because I had my own list. And I was like, I'm not seriously dating anybody that's not blah, blah, blah.
Right.
I'm not blah, blah, blah. I'm not blah, blah, blah. I am blah, blah, blah. These are the ideas that I had for my partnership. But I was at least mature enough to show up and see what was there. And she was too. So anyway, she goes, "You're 39. You don't have any kids?" I go, "No." She goes, "Okay. You've never been married?" I go, "No." She goes, "Okay.
What's wrong with you?
What's wrong with you?"
Yeah.
And the thing is, she had every right to ask it. Every right, because I knew why she was asking. But the truth is, I had been asking myself the same thing. And I was uncomfortable answering because I wasn't sure if I was not settling to settle down or I was actually getting in the way of having real intimacy.
Interesting.
And so I go, I don't want to answer that. And then it got hella awkward and the date ended soon afterwards. And I think both of us thought we were never going to see each other. And then luckily we got a second date and 6 years later, here we are.
Wow. So what made you so uncomfortable to answer that question, or what was the answer inside of you that you didn't want to share?
Well, now all these years later, she was the reason that she asked. You know, she was the answer.
It was on the love of God, on the love of God.
Are you tired of tribalism?
I think a lot of what
Delights, that takes incredible talent. It takes incredible intelligence. And thankfully, in the renewed creation, we'll have plenty of people just like that. And that response blew my mind because it made me realize later on as a leader, this has nothing to do with writing, that a good leader is not defined by what destruction and death they bring. They're defined by what life they breathe into their institutions. In other words, it is very easy, we've said this a million times, to be against something. It is very hard to be for something.
It sounds like Jerem Bars in that story he was telling you was just kind of riffing a little bit on Psalm 1, right? I mean, it says, "Blessed is the man who sits not in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord. And on his law he meditates day and night. He is like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. And all that he does, he prospers." So blessed is the man who doesn't sit in the seat of scoffers. And I think people with a negative vision, words, people who are defined by what they're against, people who are always tearing something down, people who are always finding the holes, we run that danger of sitting in the seat of scoffers. And the contrast there is between the scoffer and the one who is like the tree who bears fruit in and out of season. This is the person who meditates on the word, God's law, day and night. So for just a little bit of context, in the time that the Old Testament was written in the ancient Near East, people who are doing well still spend about 60 days a year without having enough food. So you can imagine what most people did. Most people were hungry weekly, sometimes daily, but if the people who are doing well were still hungry 60 days a year. And so the idea that you would have a tree that bore fruit in and out of season is something that everybody would have dreamed of. Everybody wanted to live near that tree. And the idea is that the person who meditates on God's word, the person who is filled with truth and righteousness and beauty and bears fruit, that is the person who can give life to people. That's the kind of person who can give life to an institution, life to a community. And of course, the alternative of that is to be the scoffer, the cynical person. Like me, I'm the most cynical person you've ever met. Always critiquing, always finding holes. Well, that person doesn't give life When I give in to my cynical side, I don't give life to people. I just spread more defeatism.
I think this contrast is really, really convicting for our moments. For the reason you just laid out, we can either be the person who sits in our scoffing, and we said it so many times, it's worth repeating. Negativity is easy. Opposition is uncomplicated. Deconstruction is undemanding. You've met simple-minded people who are not very intelligent, but they can wax eloquent when they're scoffing. And I think that's why it's so tempting to become a scoffer, is that it's an easier way of life to live in and for a negative vision and to have a negative identity. I know what I'm against. It is much more challenging to become a life-giving tree that's meditating on God's word and bringing a positive vision, positive fruit to people. And so I want you, as you're listening to this, because these are the questions I'm asking myself, to ask yourself, will you sow death through your scoffing, or will you sow life through fruitfulness? Will you be the sort of person who's dismantling your world with negative, cynical visions? Or will you be the sort of person who gives life to a new world by means of a hopeful, positive vision?
When you were saying earlier that you think there were books that were written in the past, not that far in the past either, like Tim Keller's Centered Church, that did have a positive vision, I was kind of thinking about that. And I think you're right. I mean, you don't have to go back that far in history, and you find people, Christians, who are building institutions, building denominations, building churches, or somebody like Billy Graham behind Christianity Today, whatever you think of that magazine today, it has become an institution with a positive vision that somebody built. It didn't just pop into existence. And people who are against everything, they don't build denominations. They don't build churches. They don't build nonprofits. They don't build something like a Christianity Today or World Magazine. So you don't have to go back that far to find that there was a different way than the way it seems like we've adopted today.
And I think you're getting at the next obvious question, which is, how do you actually build a positive vision? And where you're starting is a good place to start, which is leadership. You have to have leadership to have a positive movement, a movement centered around what it's for. And Billy Graham is a fantastic example. The entire what was called neo-evangelical movement was defined by leaders like Billy Graham, who we know as a great evangelist, who was the pastor to the presidents, but also helped start, like you said, Christianity Today with Carl F. H. Henry. They worked with guys like Nelson Bell to start the medical missionary movement, Harold Dikenga, who started Fuller and Gordon Conwell Seminary. You begin to realize these men were responsible for founding and starting a boatload of institutions that then had a downstream effect of starting local institutions in cities and in rural environments.
Or thinking more recently, something like the Gospel Coalition. And at least my memory of that is that's Tim Keller and D.A. Carson who got together, and there was an original council that had somebody like a John Piper in it.
Yeah.
Now, I know people are listening to this who may not love the Gospel Coalition, but that's not the point. The point isn't to evaluate all of these and say this is good or this is bad. The point is to say these were people who are trying to work together with like-minded people and build something positive to share the gospel or to help people in need or to educate people or to promote the arts, whatever it is. They were working together and built something positive.
And what set the Gospel Coalition apart, it wasn't originally a website or a conference. It was actually, it was a pastor's conference. It was focused on planting churches.
I think I was at the first one.
It was about planting churches and reaching cities. That is a positive vision. They knew what they were for, and they knew what they were trying to equip and empower people to do, to plant gospel-centered churches across the entire United States.
Did they do that, though?
I think you can say that the various movements associated with them, whether that was through the PCA's church planting network or Acts 29, there's lots. Yes, they did plant a lot of churches. Now, no positive movement is going to be perfect and plant only perfect institutions. So that's not the point. The point is they knew what they were for. And I think we're at a point now where we really need better leaders. The evangelical leadership class seems almost incapable, constitutionally incapable, of giving people a positive vision.
And that takes us back to Aaron Renn, who we've already brought up in this conversation. He has lots of passions, and one of those is masculinity and helping men. And he says, even though that's a big topic for him, he's put a lot of time and research and a lot of reading and study on it, he doesn't really have a positive vision for it. He said this: I don't always have a specific concrete vision of the future of the evangelical church or 21st century American masculinity, but I'm trying to point in that direction. So what I really like about that is this pretty self-aware to say, this is a passion of mine. I'm trying to point in this direction, but it's hard to say what I'm for. It's easier to point out when I think people have it wrong. And I think that might be the first step to being better leaders or following better leaders, is just to recognize that maybe we've got a problem.
This is like AA for negative visions. That is the first step. I think it's true. And I did appreciate Ren admitting I don't really have a positive vision. I see the need for one and I see the problem with negative visions, but I don't have one. I think it's symptomatic of many evangelical leaders today. The reason why is because our constructive muscles are out of shape. We're not used to giving positive visions. We've spent almost 10 years giving negative visions. And again, this takes me back to Psalm 1. One of my favorite things, we skipped a bit of it, is the way it describes the process of becoming a scoffer. It says, blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked. So at this point, this person's walking, okay? And then watch what happens next. Or stand in the way of sinners. Okay, so they've gone from walking with the wicked to now they're standing in place with sinners, or sit in the company of mockers. And now they finally sat down on the ground. And so, it's using this imagery of walking, standing, and finally sitting to describe the way in which we get stuck in place with our scoffing, with our sinning, with our wickedness, and our muscles, they atrophy because we've been sitting for too long. And so if you've lived in a negative vision for a long period of time, you will eventually lose the ability, the muscles required to have a positive vision and to lay out a positive path forward.
Last week, you may have listened to the conversation that I had with Tim Alberta on the podcast, and we were talking about his book, The Power, the Kingdom, and the Glory.
We both really liked this book.
Oh, I love the book. I think it was one of my favorite books of 2023. I read it at the very end of 2023, and I thought it was great. I mean, the stories are interesting, it's provocative, and all that kind of thing, but he doesn't really lay out a positive vision at all. I don't even think that was his goal at all. But in the course of that conversation, I asked him about you because I thought it was funny that he quoted you in the book. And the way it kind of played out in this chapter is he was talking about Julie Roys and her work to uncover spiritual abuse. And you had tweeted in 2023, I don't exactly remember when, you had put out a tweet noticing that Christianity Today had run many articles that were about church scandal. In fact, I think it was like 14 of the 20 top articles that year were devoted to church scandal. And so you kind of had a long form tweet, one of your threads that you're famous for, in which you examined that and asked some questions about it. And interestingly, Tim Alberta quoted you in the book saying that your point was that somehow we should cover up abuse or not talk about it or make it a family discussion, something like that, right?
Let me read the quote. He said, even some of the best, most transparent, most trustworthy pastors I'd met grumbled about Julie Roys, this is directly after he quotes me, and the journalism she inspired. If we have family disputes, these pastors said, so apparently this is what I'm saying, they should be dealt with in the family. Broadcasting our dysfunction to unbelievers only undermines our mission to evangelize them.
I think he misunderstood your point.
Well, to be candid, I was a bit surprised because I really liked the book. Tim Alberta, in my opinion, is a very careful journalist. What I found surprising is that I never mentioned any of the things that he said I apparently mentioned. I never mentioned evangelism. This was not a missional concern. I never said that we shouldn't cover abuse. I never said that we should just deal with this inside of the family. Instead, I was arguing that the flagship evangelical publication, Christianity Today, kind of the magazine of record for evangelicals, that they needed to follow the example of their founders, Graham and Henry, who gave evangelicals a vision of what they're for, not just what they're against. And that was my main concern, was that there's incentive structures that is incentivizing Christianity Today to focus on negative stories and not tell positive stories. But he completely missed it and thought that it was about things I never even said inside of the tweet. And I think this highlights a problem, which is that if you are living inside of a negative vision, you almost have a difficulty comprehending people who are coming from a place of a positive vision.
Well, I learned a new word in all of this, and that's the word bulverism, which I think, let me see if I get this right, private school Patrick, is I think that bulverism is when you assume a person is making an argument they're really not making, and then
What do is the Bible say about protests? Open Bible.info Geocoding Topical Bible Labs. Bibliolabes blog. 1. What does the Bible say about protests? OpenBible.info Geocoding Topical Bibliolabes blog. 100 Bible verses about protests. Suggestive verse. Unless otherwise indicated, all content is licensed under a Creative Commons attribution. Like Jesus turning tables, protest can be an act of faith, U.S. Catholic. Why are people so mean? Asked my friend's first grader last summer as we tried to explain what happened to George Floyd. As my friend's children learned the names George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, we had meaningful conversations about Black Lives Matter, discrimination, and why. Despite the pandemic, it was important to mask up and show up. It was a privilege to accompany them to their first protest. Solidarity, social justice, and moral courage must be taught, modeled, and practiced. But new efforts to criminalize and discourage peaceful protest are sweeping across the United States. These laws threaten a bedrock of our democracy. They jeopardize our First Amendment rights to freely assemble and speak. For those familiar with Catholic social teaching, these efforts are a significant threat to the common good. Viewing Jesus through the lens of privilege often leads people to miss the radical call of the good news. As Christians, we are called to work for the common good of each and of all. No one can be excluded or sacrificed. We are called to solidarity with our local community and to the one human family. Advertisement. But as Pope Francis notes in Let US Dream Simon & Schuster, a Christian will love and serve her country with patriotic feeling but cannot be merely a nationalist. Solidarity does not exclude opposition, it mandates it. Opposition to injustice is a form of participation in the common good. St. Pope John Paul II recognized that those protesting in opposition to injustice are searching for participation and such a definition of the common good that would permit them to participate more fully and effectively in the community. Nonviolent resistance is a powerful unbreaking of the good news, but it is important to remember that often those in power use a vision of peace filtered through privilege to undercut justice movements. The selective invocation of Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement is one key example. Dr. King would never advocate breaking the law, an older man once shouted at me as I spoke about civil disobedience at a parish talk. But I remember, growing up, how my grandparents would tell stories about marching for civil rights and against the Vietnam War. Chastised by teachers in middle school for wearing peace buttons on his jacket, my father continued to do so. Injustice was something to be discussed at the family dinner table and resisted in public. Protest is not merely about justice, it is an act of faith. Through protesting injustice, one publicly witnesses to the gospel. Jesus rejected sinful structures of exclusion in ways that provoked and made people deeply uncomfortable. Public rallies and marches are often loud and disruptive. Even when they are silent, they are still destabilizing. There is no comfortable protest. Interrupting injustice requires this kind of disruption. The stability of inequality and injustice lessens the dignity of all of us. God is paralyzed when we fail to honor the Imago Dei and the other as a human being, notes Sister Anne Arabam. Reflecting on the ways individuals and structures of society conspire to violate and distort the Imago Dei. In a theology course I teach, my students and I examine the story of Jesus tossing the money changers out of the temple. It invites a nuanced and provocative conversation about violence, property, anger, and refusal to accept the status quo. I ask students to evaluate whether Jesus is being violent when he tosses over the tables and chases people out of the courtyard. They have a deep unconscious inclination to simply filter the story through but it's Jesus glasses, largely regardless of their religious affiliation. I ask how this story would be interpreted if Jesus were a black man in America. What if it were Mary Magdalene instead of Jesus? Almost universally, students immediately note that the black man would be met with physical violence and Mary Magdalene dismissed as a hysterical woman. Viewing Jesus through the lens of privilege often leads people to miss the radical call of the good news. As Jewish New Testament scholar Amy Jill Levine says, parables exist to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. Jesus rejected sinful structures of exclusion in ways that provoked and made people deeply uncomfortable. Protest is not about making the privileged comfortable, but about destabilizing and dismantling injustice. It is not only required for a healthy democracy, it is a part of discipleship. Ongoing protest for racial justice is participation in the common good and the inbreaking of the reign of God. This article also appears in the August 2021 issue of U.S. Catholic, Vol 86, number 7, pages 20-22. Click here to subscribe to the magazine. Image, Unsplash/Clay Banks. Why so many American Christians don't understand protest, Religion Dispatches. When I was in my last year of divinity school at Duke University, I stood in an auditorium listening to Patris Cullors, a co-founder of the Black Lives Matter movement. At the end of her talk, she exhorted us to repeat the famous words of Assata Shakur. It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love each other and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains. I remember speaking the words loudly despite the lump in my throat. I felt something stir within me. It felt significant that I was saying these words on a campus consistently plagued with injustice in a world much the same. It felt prophetic. Fast forward to the Colin Kaepernick controversy. The sentiment of so many people I knew was that these protests, against Black death for Black life, for justice and freedom for all people, were disrespectful, disruptive. They shouldn't inconvenience others by blocking interstates, interrupting games. Yet in Luke 4, Jesus stood in the synagogue, echoed the words of the prophet Isaiah that the oppressed shall be free, and proceeded to be disruptive. In response to the media attention Kaepernick's actions garnered, Franklin Graham stood behind Clemson head coach Dabo Swinney and his comments about Kaepernick's protest. While Swinney stated he believes in Kaepernick's right to protest, he also told us what kind of protest is acceptable. I think everybody has the right to express himself in that regard. But I don't think it's good to be a distraction to your team. I don't think it's good to use the team as a platform. I totally disagree with that. Not his protest. But I just think there's a right way to do things. I don't think two wrongs make a right. Never have, never will. I think it just creates more divisiveness, more division. For Swinney, the right way to do things is in a manner. Why so many American Christians don't understand protest, Religion Dispatches. When I was in my last year of divinity school at Duke University, I stood in an auditorium listening to Patris Cullors, a co-founder of the Black Lives Matter movement. At the end of her talk, she exhorted us to repeat the famous words of Assata Shakur. It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love each other and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains. I remember speaking the words loudly despite the lump in my throat. I felt something stir within me. It felt significant that I was saying these words on a campus consistently plagued with injustice in a world much the same. It felt prophetic. Fast forward to the Colin Kaepernick controversy. The sentiment of so many people I knew was that these protests, against Black death for Black life, for justice and freedom for all people, were disrespectful, disruptive. They shouldn't inconvenience others by blocking interstates, interrupting games. Yet in Luke 4, Jesus stood in the synagogue, echoed the words of the prophet Isaiah that the oppressed shall be free, and proceeded to be disruptive. In response to the media attention Kaepernick's actions garnered, Franklin Graham stood behind Clemson head coach Dabo Swinney and his comments about Kaepernick's protest. While Swinney stated he believes in Kaepernick's right to protest, he also told us what kind of protest is acceptable. I think everybody has the right to express himself in that regard. But I don't think it's good to be a distraction to your team. I don't think it's good to use the team as a platform. I totally disagree with that. Not his protest. But I just think there's a right way to do things. I don't think two wrongs make a right. Never have, never will. I think it just creates more divisiveness, more division. For Swinney, the right way to do things is in a manner that doesn't feel divisive, such as a team press conference with that team's logo in the background. which apparently doesn't use the team as a platform. He appeals to Martin Luther King as an example of a peaceful Christian leader, perhaps forgetting that King's actions often divided black and white Christians and resulted in his assassination before the age of 40 for disrupting the status quo. Franklin Graham points to a spiritual response as the best course of action. He lifts up a group of law enforcement officials who take a knee in prayer before heading into the streets of Charlotte, filled with protesters following the death of Keith Lamont Scott. There's been a lot of talk in the media lately about sports figures taking a knee in protest. I'm encouraged to see people taking a knee, not in protest, but in prayer. These NC State troopers are kneeling in prayer before going in to do their jobs in the riots and demonstrations in Charlotte. Prayer does make a difference. God's word tells us, the Lord is near to all who call on him. To all who call on him in truth, Psalm 145:18. I'm thankful for the men and women trying to bring order and an end to the violence and unrest. Graham had much to say about the Charlotte protesters and the violence reported, but he didn't seem to prioritize the violence the protesters were responding to. Graham and Swinney's responses are representative of the sentiment I encountered from many in my Christian community. The appeals weren't against protest necessarily, but, like Swinney said, against a kind of protest that disturbs the order of things. I've even seen white Christian friends who, in other contexts, speak against injustice fall back when the work becomes too disruptive to their paychecks, to family harmony, to social relationships. Protest at its core is disruptive. As a Christian, my faith tells me that God understood this and disrupted the world in a human body. Filled with the Spirit, Jesus declared, "You have nothing to lose but your chains." He walked the earth, protesting the powers of death and darkness, disrupting systems as he healed the sick, embraced the poor, and ultimately claimed victory over death and the grave. It's hard for me to comprehend how so many fellow Christians misunderstand the purpose behind protest. The forms differ, but the intention is always to interrupt business as usual. Their complaint is that there are less intrusive ways to send a message. But intrusion is the point. Intrusion is acknowledging the need and urgency to disrupt an unjust and oppressive world. Especially when the light of the world, the one Christians worship, did just that. At this very moment, thousands of Native Americans and allies stand together to protect the water, the land, and the human lives endangered by an oil pipeline. Their peaceful protests have been subjected to continuous violence by law enforcement. While many Christians vilify protests enacted by the bodies of brown people who inconvenience and disrupt their lives, these same Christians are recipients of a message of good news that disrupted an ancient empire, resulting in the death of a brown savior at the hands of the state, a protest that, we believe, culminated not in death, but in the resurrection of God. The heart of the Christian faith is the ultimate act of protest. The person and work of Jesus Christ was characterized by a spirit-filled life, constantly breaching boundaries, transgressing spaces, sanctifying them in his wake. His life overcame the grave to disrupt the death-dealing systems of the world by refusing to bow to them, instead creating a new holy space where the oppressed go free. What better moment to consider our place as faithful Christians than during this season of Advent? In a time when American Christianity has perhaps sold its soul for 30 pieces of silver, taking refuge in the security of a violent empire, we would do well to remember that our good news first came as an act of divine protest in the body of a poor, brown baby born in a barn.
This program contains coarse language and images that may disturb some viewers.
In August 1999, following the fall of Indonesian President Suharto,
Ghosts of Timor, the dark stain on Australia's proudest military mission, ABC News. David Fisher, investigative journalist, every military contact since forever has had a dark stain somewhere. If you don't treat things like this in an open and honest way before the public, you get a rot that sets in. Mark Willesee, reporter, for more than 2 decades, some brave men and women have been wrestling with the ghosts of East Timor. Carl Vedler, former military police investigator, the truth has never come out. Something occurred on that battlefield that day. And I can guarantee you a lot of the guys there, they're still carrying the guilt of what they witnessed. Andrena Gill, former Interfet legal officer, had things been done the way that it should have been done, we wouldn't be sitting here today. There wouldn't be questions over what many people see was a really incredibly successful deployment. Mark Willesee, reporter, 2 decades on, those who serve speak for the first time about how these events in East Timor still haunt them. Michael Clary, former Australian Defence Force Intelligence Corps, I'm in Timor every single day, and I have been for 22 years. Some days are much better, some days are really shit. Matthew Coombs, former Australian Defence Force Intelligence Corps, the blood, the fear, the anger, all those emotions, over and over and over again. It can't help but, leave an impression. Mark Willesee, reporter, tonight, on Four Corners, the first of a 2-part series investigating a clandestine and controversial episode in what was an Australian triumph on the world stage. The military intervention in East Timor. For more than 20 years, the truth of what happened in a deadly clash between Australian Special Forces and pro-Indonesia militia has laid buried, and so too has its aftermath, in which allegations of mistreatment, torture and unlawful killing were leveled at the Australians. For the first time, we can reveal what the Australian, New Zealand and British eyewitnesses saw. Ghosts of Timor, Part 1. Mark Willesee, reporter, in September 2000, Australian military police investigator Carl Vedler was assigned a case that would change his life forever. Carl Vedler, former military police investigator, I was at work one day and across the road from my building was our military police central records office. And my major came over from there. And she talked me down to the back of a building to an area that we call it the Cone of Silence or the Tree of Silence. So people who only went there with people when we had to discuss things that were really sensitive. And she said to me, look, we've got a problem, there's allegations coming out of Timor. I'm putting together a small task force and you're going to be on the team. Mark Willesee, reporter, did you ever have any inkling how big this would become? Carl Vedler, former military police investigator, I had an inkling that it was serious, but as to what it then led into and how big it actually did become. No, I didn't. Mark Willesee, reporter, over the next 3 years Carl Vedler was part of a team set up to investigate 19 allegations involving Australian soldiers ranging from unlawful killing to the mistreatment of detainees. Carl Vedler, former military police investigator, we flew all around Australia, we visited every state except Tasmania interviewing potential witnesses. We went to New Zealand and interviewed the New Zealand SAS members that were involved in a part of it. Carl Vedler, former military police investigator, I had an inkling that it was serious, but as to what it then led into and how big it actually did become. No, I didn't. Mark Willesee, reporter, over the next 3 years Carl Vedler was part of a team set up to investigate 19 allegations involving Australian soldiers ranging from unlawful killing to the mistreatment of detainees. Carl Vedler, former military police investigator, we flew all around Australia, we visited every state except Tasmania interviewing potential witnesses. We went to New Zealand and interviewed the New Zealand SAS members that were involved in a part of it. We went to the United Kingdom and interviewed members from the British Special Boat Squadron. We went to Timor, located witnesses there and interviewed them. All up, I think we recorded over 330 witness statements. Mark Willesee, reporter, the investigation was sparked by a fatal operation involving the New Zealand and the Australian SAS. The Kiwis were so shocked by what they saw their Australian comrades do, they broke the Special Forces Code of Silence. Carl Vedler, former military police investigator, they raised concerns with the NZ legal officer, a female legal officer, and told her that things weren't quite what they seen on that day because they were concerned that they would get dragged into something that was not right. Mark Willesee, reporter, the New Zealand legal officer the Kiwi SAS raised their concerns with was Captain Andrena Gill. Andrena Jill, former Interfet legal officer, the only thing that they were prepared to say to me it was an informal situation, etc. That they thought they were doing, quote, dodgy activity. Mark Willesee, reporter, the Australian SAS were doing dodgy activity. Andrena Jill, former Interfet legal officer, yes, and that was it. But when it comes from a credible source, I think that alarm bells were ringing. It would seem to me that if they said the word dodgy, I don't think they're making it up. Mark Willesee, reporter, a proud and independent nation with a young population, East Timor is still haunted by its tragic history. And the violent upheaval of 1999 has left deep scars. We've traveled here to investigate what happened more than 20 years ago. Four Corners has spoken to more than 100 people about what happened, for many. The Interfet intervention was a source of pride, and the mere mention of these incidents is seen as an unjustifiable slur on this legacy. But for others, the story of East Timor is incomplete until this chapter is told. Mark Willesee, reporter, in August 1999, following the fall of Indonesian President Suharto, the people of East Timor were given the chance to decide their own future in a referendum supervised by the United Nations. Despite an overwhelming vote in favor of independence, pro-Indonesia militia were determined to stop this tiny territory leaving the Indonesian fold. ABC newsreader, the United Nations has decided to stay in East Timor just as horrifying evidence emerges that it's needed more than ever. Mark Willesee, reporter, the unfolding bloodshed was beamed into the homes of Australians, watching on in horror. Dr. John Cooper brings it right back. Mark Willesee, reporter, it's still a vivid memory for Australian doctor and aid worker John Cooper. Dr. John Cooper, by the time we got there, Dili was ablaze really, and I think the Indonesians have decided they weren't going to leave. They were going to raise any infrastructure. They put all this time and money into Timor, and here they were being usurped. So we're going to destroy all the things we've built up. This, our wonderful society, we're going to destroy. Mark Willesee, reporter, just days after the vote, pro-Indonesia militias exacted their revenge, swarming the town of Swai near the border with West Timor. A prominent local priest from Swai, Father Hilario, had been pleading for help to anyone who would listen. Dr. John Cooper, he told me about bodies being chucked into the swamp and the militia were killing everyone. And he said, you must come. Mark Willesee, reporter, Dr. Cooper traveled to Swai, 180 kilometers southwest of the capital Dili. ABC newsreader, it's been confirmed that at least 100 people, and possibly many more, have been massacred by the pro-Jakarta militias. The slaughter happened in the town of Swai, in a Catholic church packed with refugees. Dr. John Cooper, we knew that the bad guys were very close by. You could sort of smell it, you know. It was that toxic. They were killing and burning as they went back towards West Timor. Mark Willesee, reporter, what happened at the church in Swai would shock the world and help trigger an international intervention. Dr. John Cooper, archive, there's blood everywhere. There's blood on walls, there's blood on bamboo scaffolding. Bullets weren't used to shoot people because they're probably expensive, so they've just literally herded these people up 3 flights of stairs until there's no further to go, and they've either thrown them over or the people chosen to jump over, which about a 50 feet fall unto their death. Mark Willesee, reporter, among the ashes, he made a tragic discovery. Dr. John Cooper, they'd burnt the church precinct and all the grounds and killed people. And we went through Father Hilario's home, burnt, charred remains of, and out of the ashes near the fireplace, I picked up a pair of his glasses. And it was no doubt his glasses because it was his house. And I'd seen him with those glasses on. And he was carted off and killed, and that was all that was left in the ashes. And that was pretty confronting and pretty sad. It was indiscriminate. They were killing anyone near them. Mark Willesee, reporter, within days of the slaughter, the United Nations authorized an Australian-led multinational force known as Interfet to deploy to East Timor to stop the violence. David Freeman, former Interfet legal officer, our soldiers had the legal basis to use, up to and including, lethal force. I called it peace enforcement, or a bit of a nickname, hairy-chested peace operations. Prof. David Horner, military historian, for the first time we were doing something of this nature, we were leading a big peacekeeping force. A multinational force. The commitment was also important for the Defense Force because the Defense Force, the Army, Navy, and the Air Force had not been serving overseas on any major operations since the Vietnam War. Mark Willesee, reporter, Interfet troops began arriving on the 20th of September 1999. Prof. David Horner, military historian, the job of Interfet was to go in and establish peace. Their job was not to go in and shoot up everybody they could find. Their job was to dampen down the situation and bring it to a point where the Indonesian soldiers would leave. Dr. John Cooper, the main thing, I think in retrospect, what no one wanted was an incident because it was a powder keg. Had there been an incident, some Indonesian troops shot or a big group of Australians shot, it could have just exploded into a major war. Mark Willesee, reporter, the Australian contingent of Interfet included combat troops and a squadron of elite SAS soldiers. Michael Clary, former Australian Defence Force Intelligence Corps, we were on the first 5 Hercules in. Dili itself was a ghost town. A lot of fires, a lot of militia, we could clearly see militia on the fringes of the airstrip, openly taunting us. We took a ride through Dili on the back of this Indonesian military truck, arrived at the UN compound that had been evacuated. I think it couldn't have been more than 10 to 12 hours beforehand, and it was an absolute mess. People's lives just strewn everywhere. It was just devastating. Michael Clary, former Australian Defence Force Intelligence Corps, I will never ever as long as I live forget, this was the second day in country. And we were driving up the hill into the hills back of Dili, place called Dare where there was a Catholic church, that's where the population of Dili was. And I will never forget the sound of hundreds of thousands of people cheering. It's awesome in its full meaning of that word. Mark Willesee, reporter, a week into the deployment, Andrena Gill arrived in Dili. A qualified barrister and military lawyer, her job was to make sure that foreign troops followed the rules. Andrena Gill, former Interfet legal officer, I was on loan to the headquarters Interfet, in particular the Interfet Combined Legal Office of ICLO. And so my role there was to be part of the headquarters legal team that gave advice to the commander. Mark Willesee, reporter, and the commander was Peter Cosgrove. Andrena Gill, former Interfet legal officer, yes that's right. It was incredibly challenging because it was an unknown situation. We were grappling with many issues that we weren't used to or hadn't, perhaps, come across before. Mark Willesee, reporter, David Freeman was assigned to work with Andrena Gill at the legal office in Dili. David Freeman, former Interfet legal officer, I was part of the advanced party that went in with General Cosgrove on the 20th of September. His nickname, what we called him in Timor cause I used to go to church with him, we called him St. Peter. Of course, now he's known as Sir Peter. We'd follow him to the end of the earth. Dr. John Cooper, he was a very straight shooter. He was, I thought, very impressive. Nothing theatrical, he was very to the point, nitty-gritty down to earth sort of stuff. This is the situation. This is what we're doing. Very firm, no mucking around. Mark Willesee, reporter, for Frontline Operations, the Australian SAS would join with colleagues from the New Zealand and British Special Forces to from Response Force, the tip of the spear against the pro-Indonesia militias. Prof. David Horner, military historian, the Response Force did the things that the SAS trained for and are expert at: surveillance, gathering information, reconnaissance. They were able to move very quickly to carry out raids to secure areas if they needed to be secured. Mark Willesee, reporter, Michael Clary was a sergeant in the Intelligence Corps attached to the SAS. Michael Clary, former Australian Defence Force Intelligence Corps, so we had been with them for approximately 2 to 3 weeks in our staging area. And that was at Tyndall. My thoughts. Champions, they're really, really good guys, very professional. Very proud to have served with them. Mark Willesee, reporter, on the 6th of October 1999, a group of soldiers from Response Force had set up a roadblock at this intersection southwest of Swai. ABC newsreader, the first hostilities for Australian troops came after they moved into the troubled southwest town of Swai, conducting a sweep through the area and establishing a roadblock. Mark Willesee, reporter, it was here the SAS opened fire for the first time in the operation. ABC newsreader, they fired shots after a truck burst through the checkpoint, injuring 4 occupants. Mark Willesee, reporter, in the aftermath more than 100 people were rounded up. 14 were sent back to Dili for interrogation. The rest were escorted in a convoy by Australian SAS soldiers towards the border with West Timor. Mark Willesee, reporter, this is the road the convoy took towards the West Timor border. The SAS were in Land Rovers and a Unimog truck, the locals in an assortment of vehicles. It was right near here, about 4 kilometers west of Swai, that a deadly trap was sprung. Prof. David Horner, military historian, as they go down along the road, suddenly the trucks ahead speed up. And clearly something is happening. And very soon those 2 Land Rovers come under enemy fire, militiamen firing at them in an ambush. Mark Willesee, reporter, 2 Australian SAS soldiers were hit. One in the leg and arm, the other in the neck. ABC News reader, X-rays showed just how close Interfet came to losing its first soldier in East Timor. Mark Willesee, reporter, they were Australia's first serious conflict casualties since the Vietnam War. Prof. David Horner, military historian, but it would be a period of high tension, they'd be on a high, but they also are very tightly disciplined. And they know what needs to be done. But for these soldiers, this was the first time that they had been in action. Mark Willesee, reporter, as the two SAS soldiers received emergency treatment, response force launched a counterattack, pouring fierce fire in the direction of the militia. When the shooting stopped, two suspected militia lay dead. The Interfet commander, Peter Cosgrove, addressed the waiting media in Dili. Major General Peter Cosgrove, the militia were armed with a SKS rifle and an FN rifle. These weapons have been recovered along with their webbing, which was military-style webbing, although the men were dressed in the usual militia garb. Mark Willesee, reporter, after the clash at Swai, the bodies of the two militia were flown to Dili. Michael Clary, former Australian Defence Force Intelligence Corps, that was a big day. We had obviously been notified that there'd been a contact. I do know that a large force had been contacted by bad guys, militia, at the time. Mark Willesee, reporter, back in the Capital Intelligence Corps, Sergeant Michael Clary helped search the bodies of the dead militiamen. A confronting task, given the state of the corpses. Michael Clary, former Australian Defence Force Intelligence Corps, it was hot, sweaty, smelly, very smelly. We had like folding tables and each person was laid out on a table. For the first 5 minutes it's just about holy shit. There's two people in front of us, and to say that they had died violently is an understatement. They were very badly wounded. You're moving the bodies and a lot of fluid comes out, a lot of blood. It was a lot of gray matter. The other thing that struck me was these are two people, and that's how I have to treat them. I didn't see them as dead bodies, I saw them as people. Alan Joyce, former Australian Defence Force soldier, yeah. I can see him plain as day now. On the tables, the hole in the head, equipment laid out. SAS standing over them, take photos. Mark Willesee, reporter, Alan Joyce was an Australian Defence Force sergeant who was asked to help photograph the militiamen's bodies. Alan Joyce, former Australian Defence Force soldier, the blood on my hands a couple of times after I'd finished, I kept waking up, smelling my hands thinking, oh, I've got to wash them. I would scrub them clean. They were clean, but it's just, he said, that's just in your mind that you think they're not clean. Mark Willesee, reporter, photographs of the bodies obtained by Four Corners reveal they had horrific wounds. Some who were there believe they may have been shot at close range. Michael Clary, former Australian Defence Force Intelligence Corps, so one man was missing a greater portion of the top of his head. If I remember, it was this part of his head that was gone, and you can clearly see his brain. And we all remarked at the same time that that was done really close. And we knew that, not being experts, but we knew it because the entry wound was burnt. And you know, when you fire a weapon, there's a muzzle blast. You know, stuff comes out of the end of the barrel and it burns. If it's too close, it will burn the skin. And in this particular fellow's case, he had one of those injuries. The other fellow, from memory, was missing a greater portion of his jaw. And we made the same observation in that there was an entry wound from memory on his forehead. That was once again burned, which indicated to us that whatever was done, this had been done probably at very close range. Mark Willesee, reporter, the day after the ambush, Interfet legal officer Andrena Jill wanted an investigation because it was the first fatal shooting of the mission. In her daily diary entry, she recounted General Cosgrove's response. Text on screen, Interfet came in and basically announced he will not authorize an investigation. The OCCO can be questioned, and if they believe acted appropriately, the matter is at an end. He does not want action such as the incident last night scrutinized internally in this environment. However, my view is it could bite. It could be seen as a cover-up. Mark Willesee, reporter, in a statement, Sir Peter Cosgrove told Four Corners. Text on screen, at the time I was unaware of any alleged impropriety. Had I been, I would have immediately initiated an investigation. Mark Willesee, reporter, in the days afterward, stories about what really happened at Swai started to spread among members of the New Zealand SAS. Carl Vedler, former military police investigator, some of these guys were not happy with what happened at the scene. I believe that what they were telling us was the truth. They were extremely credible. You know, we had very good conversations with them. Carl Vettler, former military police investigator. It was a serious matter, and some of the stuff that we were bringing up you could see physically upset them. Mark Willesee, reporter. Within 12 months, a full-blown military police special inquiry was underway. Mark Willesee, reporter. What did the MP investigators? What were they trying to get the bottom of? Matthew Coombs, former Australian Defence Force Intelligence Corps. My understanding, while my recollection, was in relation to the SWI contact and the deceased militia and whether there had been unlawful killings, as a result of that contact. Mark Willesee, reporter. The investigation would stir up a world of pain for all involved. Carl Vettler, former military police investigator. Throughout the whole process, we were, at times, were treated like pariahs sort of thing. Even amongst our own people. Some of us, some people were against us. Some of them were for us. A lot of professional jealousies on some parts. Mark Willesee, reporter. The investigator's role was to determine exactly how the two militia were killed. One of the soldiers involved in the ambush was an experienced member of the Australian SAS, a leader out on the patrols highly trained in the art of war, who we will call Operator K. He would become a key focus of the long-running Australian military police investigation over the SWI ambush, with talk of unlawful killing and allegations of the mistreatment of the two bodies. Among the people the investigators spoke to were members of the New Zealand SAS, and Four Corners has obtained their statements. Mark Willesee, reporter. 3 Kiwi SAS soldiers described hearing gunshots after the firefight. Text on screen, statement of Soldier U, NZSAS, June 29, 2001. Voiceover, I heard a number of shots. Each time I heard one I went to ground. This happened about 2 or 3 times. Mark Willesee, reporter. One of his comrades pinpointed where they came from. Text on screen, statement of Soldier T, NZSAS, June 29, 2001. Voiceover, these shots came from the Australian side of the road. Mark Willesee, reporter. The Kiwi soldiers believed the shots were being fired into the militia corpses, which is illegal. Text on screen, statement of Soldier B, NZSAS. Voiceover, I heard someone call out there are rounds, just shooting the bodies, or words to that effect. Carl Vettler, former military police investigator. In the way we are trained is that when you're in a conflict, when you're fighting through, everything's fair game, but once you stop and you go back into what we call reorg, when you're pulling all the wounded and the dead bodies back, and there should be no reason to shoot anyone. Mark Willesee, reporter. A New Zealand SAS soldier informed investigators he was told that Operator K had put a few extra rounds into the bodies that were already dead. A soldier who was standing a few meters away later reported it appeared that both bodies had been shot through the throat. Text on screen, statement of Soldier T, NZSAS, June 29, 2001. Voiceover, the wounds to the throat concerned me as it was near impossible to have 2 separate wounds on each body, to the throat in similar positions. Mark Willesee, reporter. Michael Clary later told military police about a conversation he had with an Australian SAS trooper who gave a similar account. Text on screen. Voiceover, he said to me I was involved in the sweep of the contact area. I was located next to Operator K during the sweep and I saw Operator K shoot both of the bodies at close range. Mark Willesee, reporter. This SAS trooper would later tell investigators that he was dehydrated after the ambush. His recollection of events was hazy and he could not recall the conversation with Clary. But for Clary, the story swirling about SWI could not be ignored. Michael Clary, former Australian Defence Force Intelligence Corps. Those stories at the time, with the little bit of information that I knew, didn't sit well with me at all as a soldier, as a man, as a dad, as a husband. I just thought, if this is true then it's complete bullshit. That you just don't do that. Mark Willesee, reporter. Investigators uncovered an even more shocking version of events. A New Zealand SAS soldier recounted a conversation with an Australian colleague. Text on screen, statement of Soldier S, NZSAS, May 21, 2001. Voiceover, he then went on to say how Operator K was trying to claim the kills from the ambush site. He further went on to tell me how when the 2 bodies were recovered, one of them was not dead and it got up and started to run away when Operator K arced him up. Mark Willesee, reporter. Arcing up is slang for shooting, in this case someone who was allegedly running away, which would constitute murder. Alan Joyce, former Australian Defence Force soldier. If someone's shooting at you or a fellow solider, you've got the right to shoot to kill. But if they're running away and they're not a threat, then you're not allowed to shoot. Same as they might have a rival, but if they've got their hands up, you can't go, he's got a gun, and shoot him. No. Carl Vedler, former military police investigator, something occurred on that battlefield that day. And I can guarantee you a lot of the guys there, they're still carrying the guilt of what they witnessed. Mark Willesee, reporter, after the ambush, the bodies of the 2 dead militia were loaded on top of this Australian light armored vehicle, or LAV, and taken into SWI itself. The investigators were given damning eyewitnesses' accounts about what they saw Operator K do to the bodies. Text on screen, Statement of Soldier U, NZSAS, June 29, 2001. Voiceover, on our return to SWI. I can also recall seeing Operator K standing on top of this LAV towards the rear. I heard Operator K scream, "How dare you shoot my boys," or words to that effect. He was also kicking and punching the bodies as he said this. At this time I was about 10-15 meters away from the LAV and I thought to myself, fuck, he's lost it. He then kicked one of the bodies off of the back of the LAV. Mark Willesee, reporter, 3 other New Zealand SAS soldiers saw at least one of the bodies kicked off the vehicle. Text on screen, Statement of Soldier T, June 29, 2001. Voiceover, I saw Operator K standing on the rear of this vehicle. I heard him scream, "That's for hurting my lads," or words to that effect. I can also recall him kicking the bodies as he said this. He then kicked one of the bodies off the LAV and I assisted in lifting the other one down. I was shocked by what I just witnessed. Mark Willesee, reporter, another New Zealand patrol member, saw one of the bodies kicked again once it was on the ground. Text on screen, Statement of Soldier P, NZSAS, May 21, 2001. Voiceover, I also heard the distinctive voice of Operator K saying, "Got you fuckers," or words to that effect. I heard Operator K's voice emanating from the direction of where I could see a body lying on the ground. Several minutes later I looked towards the direction of the body again, only to see approximately 2 persons standing in the vicinity of the body while another kicked it 1 or 2 times. Mark Willesee, reporter, a New Zealand SAS officer, told investigators he was not surprised by these accounts. Text on screen, Statement of Soldier X, NZSAS officer, June 13, 2001. Voiceover, this seemed to fit the personality of Operator K as we had come to know him. I would describe him as a loose cannon and often unprofessional in the way he was conducting himself whilst on operations. Mark Willesee, reporter, speaking to military police, none of the Australian SAS would back up the Kiwis' accounts. But investigator Carl Vedler says some were clearly torn when recounting what happened at SWI. Carl Vedler, former military police investigator, you can always tell when someone's telling you the truth or when they're not. So when we interviewed a lot of the SAS guys, some of them nearly cried when we were talking to them. They could see it in their eyes that they wanted to say things, but out of loyalty to their fellow soldiers or whatever, they didn't go through with a lot of stuff. Mark Willesee, reporter, after the killings of the 2 militiamen. Alan Joyce says he was told by an SAS soldier to remove the bodies. Alan Joyce, former Australian Defence Force soldier, so we got body bags, had to put them in the body bag with their equipment and then, while it was still dark, let's put them back in the Land Rover, take them out to the airport. And told to put them onto the tarp and just leave them there because the locals will bury them. And I put them there because I was told to do that. We just dumped them there. No respect for them at all because they wanted to get rid of them. Mark Willesee, reporter, after the SWI mission, the New Zealand SAS complained that they were left out of the operational debrief. Carl Vedler, former military police investigator, I remember a number of the Kiwis bringing it up, saying that they were excluded. And I also believe that they may have read the post-operational report that was written. And I believe that they were concerned about what was written in that post-operational report, that it may not have truly reflected what happened. Mark Willesee, reporter, why do you think they would have been excluded? Carl Vedler, former military police investigator, I think they're excluded because they may have told the truth. Or they would have raised concerns or something like that. Mark Willesee, reporter, one New Zealand Special Forces officer told the military police investigators he believed there was a toxic element within the Australian SAS. Text on screen, Statement of Soldier X, NZSAS officer, June 13, 2001. Voiceover, I became concerned with the attitude of the SASRA, and there seemed to be a general perception that this was a shooting war, like Vietnam, and not a peacekeeping mission. I would describe their attitude as being cowboys. As a result of this, I told my soldiers, That this was a peacekeeping mission and not a war. This was to ensure that at no time could we, the NZ contingent, be tarred with the same brush, that is cowboys. Carl Vettler, former military police investigator, that was heard a lot of times or was conveyed to us a lot of times, this cowboy attitude. Mark Willesee, reporter, later New Zealand Special Forces expressed concerns to Andrena Gill about another possible breach of the rules of engagement by the Australian SAS. This prompted her to ask to look at the patrol reports. When she raised it with her boss, she says General Cosgrove intervened. Andrena Gill, former Interfet legal officer, so when he entered in the room, he interrupted our discussion about it. And he told us that we were not to look at any patrol reports, or not to examine the incidents, which resulted in the rules of engagement being actioned. Mark Willesee, reporter, in a statement, Sir Peter Cosgrove told Four Corners he recalled the conversation and said, text on screen, the officer had a notion that all patrol reports would be scrutinized in the first place by legal officers? Simply well-intentioned as it was, this was unworkable and would have paralyzed the whole operation. Mark Willesee, reporter, Andrena Gill was frustrated that her boss in the legal office was not giving General Cosgrove the advice he needed. Andrena Gill, former Interfet legal officer, I thought the head of legal, my boss would talk to Cosgrove, General Cosgrove about that. Or maybe talk him through perhaps the risks with not doing that. In the office when I was there, General Cosgrove was not challenged by him. Mark Willesee, reporter, by the 2001 the military police had come to the view that the killing of the two militiamen could have been murder. The investigators felt they were under growing pressure. Carl Vettler, former military police investigator, we just copped a lot of grief. You know, that we were tarnishing the Army's reputation, all that. Well, we didn't do it. We were only there investigating what these guys were telling us. Mark Willesee, reporter, the Defense Department called in the Australian Federal Police to advise on the case. The AFP noted there were rumors that suggested the killings were an act of revenge for the wounding of the two Australian soldiers. The AFP reviewed the evidence and stated that the two militiamen may have been shot at short range with a 9mm pistol after they had been wounded. It found the material provides some evidence toward substantiating an allegation of murder. The AFP understood the gravity of the allegations. Text on screen. Voiceover, the political impact of this investigation has been assessed as substantial and has to be managed. Mark Willesee, reporter, the AFP advised defense they could continue on alone, accept AFP help or drop the case. The military police were determined to push on. Text on screen. Voiceover, termination of this investigation is not considered to be a sound option. The allegations are known and if defense is to avoid counter-allegations of cover-up. All allegations, not just why, should be thoroughly investigated prior to any closure. Mark Willesee, reporter, to sustain a murder charge the military police needed forensic evidence, so they returned to Timor to exhume the bodies. Dr. Peter Ellis, forensic pathologist, I was contacted by, a sergeant from the military police who had received my name through the local police forensics services group who knew me and had suggested that they consult me. Mark Willesee, reporter, Peter Ellis performed autopsies on the exhumed bodies of the suspected militia in October 2002, 3 years after they were killed. Dr. Peter Ellis, forensic pathologist, with a time lapse of up to 3 years or more after death, bodies decompose. And they will decompose more rapidly in some conditions, certainly in moist, humid climates, and especially if the bodies have not been, shall we say, looked after properly after death. So, if they've been buried roughly, not embalmed, and there's been no attempt to preserve them, then they will decompose and deteriorate very rapidly. Mark Willesee, reporter, the photos from Dr. Ellis' autopsy show some evidence one man may have been shot in the back of the head. He also found both bodies had chest wounds and shattered skulls. Text on screen, report of post-mortem examination. Body identification number 489. Voiceover, the head injury is suggestive of blunt trauma applied to the front of the forehead. While a gunshot wound cannot be excluded, no obvious exit wound is detected and the back of the head is not damaged. Carl Vettler, former military police investigator, the indication was that all the damage had been caused from going inwards. The inference raised, whether it was possibly by the shape of it was possibly by the heel of a boot. So that would go along with the allegations of being stomped on. And I do believe that possibly some of the ribs had suffered fractures or damage to which would indicate that they had been kicked. Mark Willesee, reporter, and what's your personal belief about that? The stomping theory. Carl Vettler, former military police investigator. My belief taken from what I've spoken to people was that someone has gone to town on the body. Has used it their foot and then caved the head in. Mark Willesee, reporter, do we know if their body was alive or dead at the time? Carl Vettler, former military police investigator, I have no idea. I would assume. I hate saying the word assume. I believe that the body was dead because I believe that someone put some rounds into them post-battle, which... Mark Willesee, reporter, which is illegal. Carl Vettler, former military police investigator, yeah. Mark Willesee, reporter, the autopsy reports show the bodies were so decomposed they were unable to determine if they were shot at close range, but found the two men died of either gunshot wounds or blunt force trauma. Without eyewitnesses or conclusive forensic evidence, the military police were unable to recommend a murder charge. Carl Vettler, I'd put 2 years of hard work into a job. You know, in the military, our jobs is to investigate an allegation, whether it's true or not. But you put your heart and soul in it. I believe that we had a prima facie case that something occurred. Mark Willesee, reporter, based on the military police investigation, Operator K was charged with kicking the corpses. The case hinged on the testimony of the New Zealand SAS. David Fisher, investigative journalist, our personnel found themselves in the midst of somebody else's shitstorm. And it has an appearance of them trying to walk through it without getting covered in it. Mark Willesee, reporter, New Zealand journalist David Fisher investigated the Swai saga and its aftermath. David Fisher, investigative journalist, there were 9 New Zealand soldiers who were considered witnesses or persons of interest in an inquiry that was being carried out by the Australian Defence Force. That inquiry was to do with what they called indignities to a corpse. 2 of those were identified as key witnesses who would have been needed to testify in any case that went ahead against the SAS member. And they had also expressed a willingness to take part and to offer their testimony. Mark Willesee, reporter, the 2 Kiwi SAS soldiers were all set to testify against Operator K. But their superiors in the New Zealand Defence Force had genuine fears for their safety if they did take the stand. David Fisher, investigative journalist, they asked of Australia certain conditions to be put in place to protect their identities. The Australian Defence Force had gone some way down that path. They had said their identities will be protected by name suppression. So their identities aren't going to be something that will be easily accessible to the public. From a New Zealand perspective, though, that wasn't enough. The New Zealand Defence Force had said to Australia, we want more than that name, suppression isn't enough. We want them to be known by their call signs. Mark Willesee, reporter, Four Corners has been told the Australian military magistrate hearing the case ruled that the names of the Kiwi witnesses had to be revealed in court out of fairness to Operator K. David Fisher, investigative journalist, so the end result of the debate about name suppression and using call signs was that there was no testimony from the New Zealand soldiers. The case collapsed, and that was the end of it. Mark Willesee, reporter, the criminal case against Operator K fell apart and he was acquitted. His court records remain suppressed to this day. The Army pursued administrative action against him, but he was again found not guilty. Carl Vettler, former military police investigator, at the end of the day there's an investigative process. And the evidence has to be put through a court of law, and that never occurred with this one. Carl Vettler, former military police investigator, to say that he was acquitted is really, to me, it grinds. It upsets me. It upsets the guys on the team. Mark Willesee, reporter, after Operator K complained, General Peter Cosgrove, by then Chief of the Defence Force, ordered an inquiry. It found the military police investigation took too long, the investigators were inexperienced, and the quality of witness statements was poor. Operator K received a formal apology. The military police believed it was payback. Sir Peter Cosgrove told Four Corners that he has no knowledge of this sentiment and refutes any sense of payback. Carl Vettler, former ADF military police investigator, it has caused us a lot of grief. It caused strain of my marriage. My wife doesn't know anything about what I did in the investigation. The first she'll actually know about the investigation is if she sits down and watches this interview. So for 2 years of my life I couldn't tell her what I did, and for the 15 years since I got out I've never spoken to her about it. Mark Willesee, reporter, some of those involved in the special inquiry believe the failure to obtain a prosecution had consequences for later operations, and was the first link in a chain leading to alleged SAS war crimes in Afghanistan. Carl Vettler, former military police investigator, if things had have been different, and that protection had have been given to the New Zealanders, I don't think we would have had some of the issues that we had in Afghanistan. I think it gave the wrong message to some people in various organizations that they could do what they want and get away with it. Mark Willesee, reporter, there were more allegations against the Australian military in East Timor. The New Zealanders were so concerned they began a secret investigation into their Australian comrades. And what it found was even more shocking. Next week on Four Corners. Evidence of torture. David Freeman, former Interfet legal officer, it's outrageous. I mean, you can't do that. I use the word outrageous and unlawful. Andrena Gill, former Interfet legal officer, sometimes I think I do wish I did nothing. I wish I had said nothing. I wish I had turned my back. But that wasn't really an option. I had no choice and I suffered the consequences. Doctors and pharmacists left in the dark after being named in Medisecure data on the dark web, ABC News. In short, doctors and pharmacists named in a sample of stolen Medisecure data posted on the dark web say they've received no contact advising them their information had been published online. Medisecure has been criticized for being slow to respond to the leak and notify those affected. What's next? The federal government is investigating the leak, and patients have been advised current prescriptions are not affected. Doctors and pharmacists named in a sample of stolen Medisecure data up for sale on the dark web say they are yet to be contacted by the company despite their information being available online for over a week. A sample of data from the electronic prescription provider seen by the ABC contains clinician login credentials, as well as prescriber numbers and medical practice details. The sample does not include patient names but has encoded script numbers, pharmacist approval numbers and medication instructions linked to the prescribing doctor and dispensing pharmacist. Included in the sample of data posted online is a screenshot showing the full names and prescriber numbers of 11 Australian doctors. Of the 4 doctors the ABC was able to speak to, all said they had had no contact from Medisecure or authorities about the hack. Sharon Gupta, a Western Sydney GP whose name appeared in the sample, said it was concerning that the first she heard about it was from the ABC. This is very, very problematic, especially depending on what kind of information is leaked, she said. To have it leaked on something like the dark web is very serious. Yusuf Saadi, a doctor from southwestern Brisbane, said he was very concerned when the ABC told him his details were on the dark web. Failure to protect medical data brings the safety of electronic records under question, he said. Do you know more about the Medisecure data breach? You can securely contact Telise Worthington at protonmail.com. Medisecure data on sale for the best price. 3 weeks ago it emerged publicly that Medisecure, formerly one of the 2 main providers of medical prescription services in Australia, had been hacked. 1 week later, a user posted in a Russian cybercrime forum on the dark web, claiming they had the Medisecure data and were selling it for $50,000. The dark web is a hidden part of the internet that is not accessible with standard search engines or internet browsers, making it an attractive place for hackers to peddle their wares. Included in the user's post were several screenshots, seen by the ABC, which appear to contain legitimate prescription information. Earlier this week the user posted an announcement which said they had received many proposals and asked people to send through their best offers. As a person motivated by money, I am setting a new rule, they said in a screenshot provided to the ABC. After 4 days, the base will be sold to the one who offers the best price. Health data valuable to cybercriminals. Doctors told the ABC that they felt they should have been informed sooner that their names and personal information had appeared in this leak. Dr. Gupta said without a full picture of what other information was up for sale, it was hard to tell what it could be used for. I would need to know exactly how much information has been leaked, she said. I think there should have been more direct contact with the doctors. This is quite unsettling to find out this way. Dr. Saadi agreed, saying he wanted more information. All I know is that my prescriber number and my name was stolen. This data already comes on any script that a GP issues, and I don't see any risk if that is the only stolen data, he said. However, I cannot be sure until I'm reassured by related authorities. A Department of Home Affairs spokesperson told the ABC, Medisecure has a legal obligation to notify individuals at risk of serious harm as a result of the data breach that affected the company. Data could be used to better target scams. The doctor's details, including Medicare provider numbers and prescriber numbers, would not be enough information to gain access to Medicare records. The department said. These claiming systems include security measures to prevent unauthorized access, the spokesperson said. Regardless, cybersecurity expert Evan Vaughdis from NSB Cyber said medical data was valuable to cybercriminals and could be used to make scams more targeted, or even to try and access medication. If you know somebody's name, their date of birth, their address, and what medication they're on, there are numerous avenues where things can happen, he said. Cyber incident still under investigation. Earlier this week, Medisecure went into administration after its request for a bailout from the federal government was denied. Medisecure has still not said how many Australians have been affected, but confirmed the data taken was from its systems up until November last year. Both the federal government and the Australian Medical Association, AMA, the peak professional body for doctors, said they believe the hack did not affect current prescriptions. We have advised our members that they should continue to prescribe as per usual, AMA President Steve Robson said. Patients should continue to have their prescriptions dispensed, and Medicare provider numbers or PBS prescriber numbers do not need to be changed. The ABC sent a list of questions to Medisecure's administrator FTI Consulting, but it declined to comment, citing an ongoing federal government investigation. A spokesperson referred the ABC to an earlier statement which said, "We will be speaking to the Australian government about what they need from the company and the next steps in the response to the cyber incident." The government's digital health agency said in January over 189 million electronic prescriptions had been issued since May 2020 by more than 80,000 prescribers, GPS and nurse practitioners. Contact the ABC's specialist reporting team. Posted yesterday at 5:43 am Sat June 8, 2024 at 5:43 am. Updated yesterday at 7:21 am Sat June 8, 2024 at 7:21 am.
Whoa! Ciao, ciao, bye bye, love you.